You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is Thursday, October 24th, 2024, 7:35 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And we talked about the earthquake of abandonment terror last week. So I thought that we would talk about the tsunami of terrible sadness this week. Uh, Mainly, we're talking about this because of exploration and the things that get in the way of exploration. I'm doing a workshop on Saturday, you may have noticed, about exploration, and uh, we I tried to figure out a way that I could talk about advanced mentalizing in a way that would have broader appeal. And exploration turned out to be the vehicle for talking about advanced mentalizing and what you need to be able to mentalize in order to explore it in a deep way, in a primary way. And then, because one of my lifelong explorations is photography, I thought I would use that as an illustration. So that's what we're going to do on Saturday. But the earthquake of abandonment terror and the tsunami of terrible sadness are this sort of 1-2 punch that takes out your exploration. And so it can be useful to talk about it in that way. If you grow up in a family system where who you are is appreciated and you have caregivers who are curious about that and they support you in developing that authentic nature of who you are, then you learn to express yourself authentically and you learn to pursue the experiences that come from the activation of that authentic self. You might even call it a creative self that arises in response. But if you grow up in insecure and disorganized family systems, then the authentic expression is not highly valued. And what is valued instead is the either in an insecure way, the role that works in the family system that you are in some ways pressured to adapt to, or in a disorganized family system, really what happens are these extreme defenses that arise in order to manage the environment that you're in. One of the things about this, though, is if you are required to be a certain way in the family system, or you avoid any kind of authentic expression in the family system because you need to protect that, you need to preserve it from what can go wrong in a family system, then you spend the time, energy, and resources you have developing the insecure or disorganized self, and the authentic self is in some ways set aside. The full self is what Masterson used to call it, or I guess he's not on the planet, but in that school of thinking, that early understanding of how personality forms and how it is either anchored onto the authentic sense of self or anchored onto the false sense of self that's required in the family system. We develop this really, pretty well-defined, pretty functional, pretty good false self, but our authentic self is not in that way developed. And so we get good at navigating the world in this guise of the inauthentic self-expression. We get pretty good in insecure, organized family systems of going after secondary exploration, the gathering of time, energy, and resources that are necessary to support a life. But we don't get so involved in the activities that provide meaning for us, because our way of operating in the world is not centered in authenticity, it's centered in inauthenticity. And even if we were to discover what was important for the inauthentic self within the family system, it wouldn't resonate at that meaning level that a primary exploration attached to the expression of an authentic self would. That all making sense so far in this frame? In those kinds of family systems, when the reaction to the present moment conditions is in the authentic experience, what it tends to do is cause a strong abandonment terror. This is the earthquake of abandonment terror, because either you're afraid to express it because you need to protect it, or you're afraid to express it because it isn't valued in the family system and you're redirected into something else, often with the accompaniment of shaming for being interested in the kinds of things that you might be interested in. And what's held up instead is this idea of who you need to be in the family system so the family is valuable. The way that it worked out in my family system was we had a presentation that we needed to be outwardly facing, and there was a lot of pressure to maintain that public facing presentation, but it didn't match at all what was happening within the family system. And we weren't permitted to really talk about what was happening in the family system, mainly my mother's drug addiction and really sort of low functioning, and my dad's really sort of sadistic treatment of us. It was just not allowed. And so the contrast between that outward facing ideal family and the inward reality of it created these really sharp schisms, which we needed to protect ourselves from, because for children, the world needs to be ordered. It needs to be within a range of intensity that's manageable. And as soon as things exceed that, we become quite frightened as children, and it interferes with our ability to function very well. That all making sense? When you look at that spike of abandonment terror, what the mind does immediately is come up with versions of reality, inauthentic alternatives that are relieving of the abandonment terror. So you're not so far down the rabbit hole of inauthenticity, a sense of what the authentic experience is, and it spikes the abandonment terror. Then the mind immediately generates a version of the self-expression that is designed to relieve the abandonment terror. And if you express that, it does, in fact, relieve the abandonment terror, and the system comes back into balance. And the delusion in that Buddhist sense of it, that you're not seeing clearly what actually is happening, is that's preserving the balance, that's preserving the relationships. But actually what it is in some sense annihilating the authentic self, annihilating the passageway where you would derive meaning. As Mary Oliver says, this one wild and precious life that you have. So you go that route, and a little while later, you're starting to get angry, and it comes from deprivation. You're not free to express your authentic self. You're not free to request the things that you authentically need to happen. And so you come into a state of deprivation where your authentic needs are not being met, even if the inauthentic needs are taken care of. Because the authentic needs are not being taken care of, there's still a sense of deprivation. And then you get angry at the people that are forcing you into this inauthentic expression and this state of deprivation. And so there's a separation, the other people that you might rely on. All right, I've just explained that to you. Now it's all resolved, and you can just be authentic in the next moment, right? Which is unfortunately not true because of this bummer called conditioning. We anticipate in that process of generating conceptual reality what a potential outcome would be. And if over and over again in our childhood experiences, when we accidentally let the authentic expression slip and we're immediately chastised in some way for it, our capacity to step out of that inauthentic expression is inhibited by our anticipation of what's going to happen. And Mudit?
George, sorry to interrupt.
No.
Can you share ways in which people are inauthentic?
I have one example that I like, and if it isn't good, we can try another. So you go to a movie with somebody, and you sit down there, and it's the worst movie you've ever seen. I mean, it is terrible. You can't even believe that you want to go to the manager and ask for your money back. It was so bad. And then as you're walking out of the theater, the person looks at you all doe-eyed and said, "That was the best movie I ever saw." What are you going to do? The authentic thing would be, "That was the worst piece of shit I've ever seen. What did you like about it?" Right? But you may think that they would abandon you if you did that. And then you would be too frightened to express yourself. And then you would say, "Yeah, that was a pretty good movie," which would be the inauthentic expression. Right? Christian?
I don't know if this is, maybe this is manipulative in some way, but when I am with someone and I want to elicit their opinion and I feel like they're likely to give me the inauthentic expression, I will hold my own opinion back and then I'll elicit their opinion so I can get it without like being in reaction to mine. And
Uh-huh.
then I'll let it rip and I'll be like, no, I fucking hated this thing.
And the question is whether it's manipulative or not.
Well, I want the authentic expression, so
um, in a secure relationship where you feel confident that the relationship isn't going to be threatened by your opinion, you're free to express whatever you want, right? Oh, you thought that was a good movie? I'm completely baffled. What about it, right? And that thing. Mudit?
So it's essentially expressing opinions. That's the only way somebody can be inauthentic.
Well, you're inauthentic by not allowing somebody to see your authentic response.
But the response,
However it happens.
how, so most of the time it would be opinions of people.
Well, how else do you communicate if not in a verbal expression? Body language. Do you restrict the expression of body language? Restrict expression of attention. It isn't necessarily always language, and in fact, language is also accompanied by the whole expression of the body, and so I work in this mode quite a bit in Zoom land, and I can tell you that some people are hypersensitive to whether I'm looking directly at the screen or not. And if I look away even for a moment, they chastise me for not paying attention. I even had somebody said, "How dare you look away from the screen? I'm paying for your time." So that people are very sensitive to the whole expression. So it doesn't have to be a languaged opinion. It could just be the feeling of you. When somebody reaches out to touch you, do you lean into the touch? Do you stay the same? Do you pull away from the touch? All of that is what's being expressed.
Sorry, that's a preoccupied state of mind, right? I also had this thought of
Yes.
the eyes moving.
Uh-huh.
Somebody. So is that an expression that I'm feeling that you are not paying attention to me?
Right.
A sense that abandonment is there?
Right.
Okay.
The abandonment arises, but then how do you allow yourself to know that? So if you went into an immediate dismissing view, you would think that they were actively rejecting you, right? And you would feel a loss of proximity if you were preoccupied, and then you would be eliciting a return to proximity, which is what the demand would be. If you're fearfully preoccupied, the demand would be sharp like that. And if you were more in a helpless preoccupation, it would be more seductive to get your attention back.
Oh, I see. Seductive, not aggressive, like a dismissive person.
Right. And a dismissing person could come seducing, or they could come bullying. It depends on what they think would be more effective. They're not really committed to it because they can switch on a dime. The bullying doesn't work, they just switch back to seduction.
You mean the sweetness, right? The
The sweetness.
Thank you.
One of the things about attachment conditioning, of course, is you develop skills at picking up beyond language, but you can also, because of childhood attachment conditioning, have a very limited way of gathering information, and you could be one of the outcomes of childhood could be that the only way you have any sense of somebody else is in language, what they say. You have no real way of checking whether what they're saying to you is true or not because of your limited capacity to pick up on facial expressions and body languages. You restrict emotion so you don't have good empathy, or your own internal emotional state is so dysregulated you can't really tune in on the empathetic experience because your internal life is so chaotic. That's making sense. So let's say you recognize that this process of your authentic expression arises, but it activates an intense abandonment terror. But you decide that you're going to begin this process of pushing into authentic expression, and you push in and make the authentic expression, or you recognize that you haven't and you repair it as fast as you can, and the abandonment terror spikes up. But these things are waves. So the spike is this wave that arises and passes. And then that earthquake of abandonment terror causes the reaction of the tsunami of terrible sadness, and it comes rushing over you. And then when we begin to take apart the terrible sadness, what the terrible sadness is a reaction to the experiences of your authenticity being lost in the childhood conundrum. And because of the different ways in which attachment conditioning affects the development of attachment, it also affects the way that the terrible sadness accumulates, and they're around different kinds of experience. So, Jordan, you're muted.
Sorry. When you reference a tsunami of terrible sadness, are you referencing something similar or the same thing to like the pool, what you would call like the pool of poison and pain?
I think that often the pool of poison and pain activates in response to the activation of the tsunami, but the tsunami is really a reaction to the present moment, the terrible sadness. And it often exceeds the window of tolerance, so it could also be accompanied by self-generated emotion. And then it could also activate the pools, and so you have all three of them activating. But it usually starts in the response to the
I see. So follow
inside of the
along with the
present moment.
metaphor of the pool, and that, tsunamis and what have you occur on the surface.
Yeah, but it could be that the tsunami is so intense that it's then pushed into the pool. So you could have a pool that matches pretty well with that terrible
Right.
sadness.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So what happens with the terrible sadness is it's a recognition of how your conditioning has affected your life. And in dismissing people, the terrible sadness is really oriented and began with the realization in childhood that nothing you did, and you tried everything, nothing you did changed the equation where your caregivers would actually be responsive to you. There was nothing that you could do in the authentic expression of yourself which would get them to be responsive to you. And what you ended up having to do was to abandon yourself and become the idealized version that your caregivers wanted of you. And in that abandoning of self, you also abandon awareness that that was what was happening. It's the process of developing the skill of idealization, where you strip out anything negative and live in these idealized expressions of mainly of the caregivers and the life that they provide for you. And one of the things that really intensifies the experience of the terrible sadness is that it had so little to do with the things that really mattered to you, that all of that had to be handed over in order for you to operate in this idealized version that was demanded of you. Sometimes there's a kind of self-accusation that you should have done something differently than that. But I do want to reassure you that all children submit. They really don't have any choice in the matter. There wasn't leeway for you to have chosen yourself. The 3-year-old hobo that walks out the door, doesn't happen. I remember, and I can give you an example from my childhood. One day, my sister went outside, got on her tricycle, and rode off. And everybody, all the adults, started looking in the neighborhood. They couldn't find her, and eventually the police were called. And she rode off in the morning at like 5:30 in the afternoon. The police cruiser pulls into the driveway, and he opens the trunk and takes my sister's tricycle out of it, and she opens the back door, and my sister climbs out of the back door. She looks at me and she said, "I could have got away." But to where? They said they found her 7 miles away, which is on a tricycle quite a triumphant attempt. The in the preoccupied dilemma, the the terrible sadness is linked to the idea that you again, it's this abandonment of self, but it has a slightly different coloring to it. The terrible sadness of the dismissing is that everything you do, everything that you try, nothing succeeds in attracting the attention and care of your caregivers. In the preoccupied mind, the problem is that because the child becomes dependent on the emotional regulation of the caregiver, and because the child is often role reversed into caring for the caregiver, the child who is seduced into this belief that the caregiver can't really survive or function without the intervention of the child. What the child begins to see is that they are the ones who abandoned themselves, and they are the ones who chose to stay and take care of the caregiver when the time came for them to be able to go off and do something else. And so the terrible sadness for the preoccupied person is the sense of the self-abandonment. I didn't take the opportunities because I couldn't tolerate the loss of proximity. Is that making sense? The terrible sadness for disorganized people is around the great betrayal. The caregivers actually harm the children, and they either do it in a hapless way or they do it in a sadistic way. And the idea that you would have a caregiver that then harmed you is so terribly difficult to hold, and the betrayal is felt in such a deep way, and the sadness surrounding that is held in such a deep way that's that experience. And so when we talk about the activation of the terrible sadness in response to the activation of exploration, often the activation of that abandonment terror and then that activation of the terrible sadness interferes with the capacity to actually engage in a meaningful way with exploration. Organized, insecure people tend to be really focused on social status as a way of validating themselves. They tend to be very focused on secondary exploration, which means they're also focused on what is societally and culturally valuable. And if they get to a place where they have to choose between what is authentically meaningful to them and something that is valuable culturally or societally, or that offers access to a high social position, it's very difficult for them to choose their authentic exploration and to choose meaning and to abandon the cultural values that can come from achievement, even when the experience of achieving doesn't provide an effective enough source of meaningfulness. It's still hard. What happens to disorganized people and on the preoccupied end of disorganization, so fearfully preoccupied people, is they become so controlling, they squash any kind of collaboration that might help them in exploring. In order to take big risks in exploration, you kind of have to have a safety net. Otherwise, the risks, particularly if the risks would lead to a kind of emotional dysregulation that you would have a hard time managing, you tend to be more reluctant to take a big risk if there isn't some place to catch you. And that safety net, of course, is the social network that you put around yourself when you're in that fearfully preoccupied mode of thinking, and you're extremely controlling about everything, that demand, that insistence on being in control of everything actually has the opposite effect that you might want, in that it pushes people away from you rather than draws them in to support the collaborative experience of that social support, going out and taking risks and coming back into an expression of that. Fearful avoidant people, the main difficulty for them is that they don't trust themselves, particularly to evaluate who would be trustworthy and who wouldn't be trustworthy, to collaborate with, because the experience of their childhood was really ordered around their trusting people and then being exploited and betrayed by them. And because most of the time in childhood, that's a kind of, trying to think of, anyway, those relationships that turn sour in that way are often cultivated over time, so that the child's trust is invoked and the child's attachment is invoked and then betrayed. Is that all making sense, Henry?
Was that last part for disorganized or preoccupied people who don't trust themselves to evaluate who to trust or not?
Disorganized, avoidant, more fearful avoidant people, that's true of, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Fearfully preoccupied people tend to be controlling, and that's how they manage it. And fearfully avoidant people, because their capacity to identify who will harm them and who won't harm them has been compromised, they're reluctant to go into collaborative relationships because of that. That reluctance is greater than ordinary reluctance, so that in organized attachment systems, there is always some slowness at the beginning in the formulation of relationships, because you don't really know who the person is and you want to find out who they are. But the defensive barriers that disorganized people put up are so massive that organized people give up before they get through the walls, which leaves disorganized people vulnerable to predators, because predators don't give up, and they're the ones who get through the defenses because of that. Or they activate a sense of reality in the disorganized people, that they're back in an abusive situation and there's nothing that they can do to stop it, and so they don't rally, prevent the abuse after the initial defenses are breached. And it creates in them this belief that that they have a target on them, and people can identify them. And this isn't actually what happens. What happens is that they rebuff everybody who puts a normal amount of pressure on, and they don't rebuff the people that put an extreme amount of pressure on. And then when they feel frightened sufficiently, they become passive, and so they don't resist. And the predators can't tell the difference. They just bang on everybody to see whose defenses they can get through. So when we're talking about this reclaiming of authenticity and this moving into a place where we can activate the creative sense of self, we can activate the authentic sense of self, so that we can begin to organize around the meanings, the values that authentic curiosity will lead us to. we need to be able to manage both the abandonment terror and the terrible sadness. The abandonment terror it tends to be a spike that arises and passes pretty quickly, and the terrible sadness tends to be something that lingers. Paradoxically, the way out of the terrible sadness is simply not to resist it and just allow the full intensity of the sadness to arise. It, like all things, is impermanent, and it arises and passes. The dismissing person has spent their entire life developing these very defensive structures of sort of self-aggrandizement to keep them away from the terrible sadness. And if you can allow yourself to drop into the terrible sadness and not get away from it and allow the full intensity of it, those defensive structures just fall apart because you don't need them anymore, because you don't need to protect yourself from the terrible sadness. And so for organized dismissing people, it resolves the quickest, which isn't to say that sitting into the terrible sadness is easy, but it is something that can be managed. In preoccupied people, there's a lot more to do in organized preoccupied people. One of the things that dismissing people already have is a high level of mentalizing, not quite at the level of security, but close. And preoccupied people don't have that level of mentalizing. And so one thing that has to be developed is the capacity to mentalize so that you can begin to discern what is authentic and what isn't authentic. In that mentalizing frame, the first step is to understand what is the experience of reality that you've just generated. Is it accurate to what's happening? The second part is understanding what it is about the experience of the present moment that you want to express, and how do you express it so that you communicate what you want somebody else to know. And the better you know somebody, the more adaptive you are in terms of the expression of it. Then you make the expression and monitor the reaction to the expression that the other person makes, and ensure that you understand both that they understand what you've communicated and that you understand their reaction to that. And then you modify, that's the fourth piece, your understanding of the relationship with the advent of this new information. When you look at a preoccupied modeling of mentalizing, the preoccupied person throws up a presentation to the other person, and then they monitor whether the other person is going to meet their needs or not. And if their need is not met at the end of that exchange, they just modify their presentation and express it again, monitoring only whether or not their need is met. And then if it's not, they just make another expression in the attempt to get the need met. And so there's a lot that has to be built out around that. One is that you have to monitor well enough to know what meaning you've made of the experience of the present moment you have. You have to develop the mentalizing capacity to understand what about that you want to communicate, rather than just throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. You actually have to formulate a way to express it that is authentic. And then you have to be willing to monitor the outcome of your expression and then modify your understanding. That requires a lot of development of mentalizing. Then what you have to do is figure out how to explore. Before you even get to discovering what's meaningful, you have to figure out how to discover whether something is meaningful or not. And dismissing people can already do that. Disorganized people, depending on which end of it, if they're more fearful, avoidant, they already have the capacity to explore. What they don't have is resilience. And fearfully preoccupied people don't explore particularly well. And so they have all of that to do. Complexly disorganized people, really the circumstances of childhood to get you into a state of complexly disorganized are really, really harsh. And so there's a lot to do in terms of working toward establishing epistemic trust. Epistemic trust is where you believe somebody is telling you the truth because they have evidence, right? And you believe that the reason that they're telling you what they're telling you is because they want it to be helpful to you. And if that's true, then you can learn from them. And if you don't have epistemic trust, it's hard to learn from them. And epistemic trust is compromised in insecurely organize people because you don't really focus so much on the evidence. In secure relationships, you tell somebody something, but you have to have evidence to demonstrate that it's true. Whereas in insecure relationships, people don't check the evidence. So people can say whatever they say. And the reason for that is that as a child, if you checked up on your caregiver, you would see that what they were telling you was often not true, and that's worse than accepting something that isn't true as true. And then disorganized people, because there's the conundrum of being harmed by the people that are taking care of you is once you, of course, can ride out the spike of abandonment terror and you can ride through the wave of terrible sadness, then you can get to the place of activating the authentic self and beginning the process of discovering what's actually meaningful. Henry?
Yes. I was wondering if if you have a good resource for kind of the terminology on all this stuff and the frameworks of how it all fits together. I think I can get tripped up sometimes on fearful, dismissive, just all the different attachment terms.
Do you have our poster?
I don't think so.
We have a poster.
Okay.
See if I have one here. Yes. This is a poster. And this has all the different attachment strategies and all the different responses that you're likely to experience in different activities that people engage in. It includes the terrible sadness and the earthquake and all the rest of it. So because most of this terminology is mine, this is a good example.
Cool.
If you're,
Thank you.
it's on our website. You can order it.
Sweet. Thanks so much.
I mix. So in the original attachment development, Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby hooked up these three different aspects: secure, anxious, avoidant, anxious, ambivalent. That was the original three. And those are child categories because the original testing was of children in the strange situation, which was Mary Ainsworth. Then they wanted to see whether these attachment strategies carried over into adult life. And in order to identify the adult categories, they named them differently. Secure became secure, anxious, avoidant became dismissing, anxious, ambivalent became preoccupied. So the adult categories are secure, dismissing, and preoccupied. Mary Main and Eric Hesse up at Berkeley. Mary Main was a postdoc with Mary Ainsworth. Went through the strange situations that they couldn't classify, which they called CC, and discovered disorganization. So that became the fourth category. So they had CC, and then they had disorganization, which is around the loss of coherence in the transcript. And so when you look at attachment, some of them match child categories and adult categories, and some don't. But you could call it a five-way: secure, dismissing, preoccupied, disorganized, and cannot classify. I like to talk about disorganization because we work with a lot of disorganized people, and this is not really true of the research community, because they're doing researches at elite universities where disorganized people are not as popular. What do you know about getting into an elite university? It's competitive. What do you know about fearful, disorganized people? They're not reliable. They can't do it. But I like to talk about, and these are colloquial psychology, psychotherapy type terms: fearful, avoidant, fearful, preoccupied. But then I also like to talk about complexly disorganized, because complexly disorganized people can be preoccupied, avoidant, or secure sometimes even. And so in the map that we talk about, we have, for adults, a secure, dismissing, helplessly preoccupied, and then on the disorganized side, we have fearfully preoccupied, fearfully avoidant, and complexly disorganized. Would it?
I wanted to ask about the theory. I know there's a lot of complexities in how people behave in different attachment styles, but how useful is that if somebody wants to move to secure attachment? Isn't simply doing IPF enough? The details, unless I want to be somebody wants to be a trainer.
I don't think that IPF on its own is enough. It's a three-pillar approach, and you have to do all three pillars. So depending on how you do it is what's different. IPF will not really develop mentalizing enough. So you have to have some focus on mentalizing. In order to move into secure functioning relationships, you also have to have a higher level of emotional regulation and alternative regulation strategies to what you have in insecure, disorganized attachment. So you have to do mentalizing and emotional regulation training in order to develop the capacity for that. You can do that in the therapeutic side through therapy, where you engage in some mentalizing and emotional regulation therapy, or you can do it with the meditation approach that we like. And then you also need some instruction in how secure collaborative relationships are supposed to function, because if you grew up in a household where insecure or disorganized relationships were modeled, you don't actually know how they're supposed to be operating. And you can think that the way that people are responding to is actually not a good way when it's more secure. So for instance, the preoccupied person needs constant proximity, and they're willing to sacrifice their own exploration in order to maintain the proximity. But a secure person won't allow that proximity because it interferes with their exploration. And so they would want some kind of space in a relationship where they could explore, and that would be acceptable, but it wouldn't necessarily be acceptable to the understanding of a preoccupied person of how it's supposed to work. So you also have to have the education around and the modeling of how relationships are supposed to function so that you can move into that kind of relationship. All three of them have to happen.
Yeah, sorry, I thought when I said IPF, I meant mentalizing as well.
Oh,
So if
okay.
a preoccupied does IPF as well as mentalizing work, will he automatically feel not the need to be in physical proximity eventually?
Yes, I would think.
Okay.
Because they would value their own exploration, and they would have alternative ways to regulate themselves so that the anxiety that propels them to seek constant proximity would be managed in a different way and they wouldn't need to.
Gotcha.
That when you earn security, one of the remarkable things is that anxiety goes away. And I like to say it's not that you get better tools for managing the anxiety, it just doesn't come up anymore the way that it used to come up. So you don't have to manage it because it's been resolved. Dismissing people become more spontaneous, and they stop rehearsing everything and stop managing the presentation of everything. And they get to where they don't anticipate rejection, which is how they experience the abandonment anxiety, the constant over monitoring to avoid rejection and shame. They don't need to do anymore, so that drops away.
That the rejection doesn't come up in the conscious experience at all, or does it come up and they're like, wait a second, this is just another thought, and they would,
Well, it doesn't come. We're all sensitive to being accepted by the people that we want to be accepted by, but so you have an awareness of that happening, but it doesn't turn into that intense abandonment anxiety or that intense anticipation of rejection, so that it changes the way that you present yourself from authentic to inauthentic.
but it still arises in awareness.
It arises in levels that still allow you to present yourself authentically. That's the main difference, is and that anxiety or that anticipation of rejection prevent you from expressing yourself authentically.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when it's in a level where it doesn't prevent the authentic expression, you continue to gather the information that you can express yourself authentically and not risk the relationship.
Almost like a tolerance scale that you develop, and you have more tolerance now to be slightly more authentic, and then
Right.
pushing that more and more.
And the more you do it, the more conditioned you become to anticipate a positive response from the authentic expression, to where there's very little resistance to being authentic.
Mm.
And,
But,
I use the Minesweeper metaphor, the old PC game. You ever played it? Sometimes you click on a square and half the board opens up. It's remarkable how fast you can move into authenticity in certain areas. And then you get into another area and it's so compacted and so difficult because there's so much conditioning around. Alex.
Yeah. Hi. So the terror and the sadness, how long could these last for?
A lifetime.
Oh, good.
Unless you do something about it. But how long do they last in the moment of activation? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think so. That
So,
then maybe I understand better. It's more on the scale of like minutes or hours. Or...
The initial blast of it is seconds, but then how do you manage a intense emotional experience? Do you use thoughts? Most people use thoughts to manage it. What kind of thoughts do you use to manage it, and does that just keep it going? So let's say you're a dismissing person and you have a spike of abandonment terror, which you don't really allow yourself consciously to feel, and then you just hear your mind giving you all the reasons why you're going to be rejected. I'm too short, I'm too tall, I'm too thin, I'm too fat, I'm too this or that. I mean, the mind will generate that whole string of reasons why you're going to be rejected, and then you're amping up the response, amping up the sadness. Maybe that kicks out the somaticized emotion of that particular experience over and over again, and then the weight of that intense emotional experience, which is that at this point entirely thought driven, prevents you from making the expression, which reinforces the idea that the rejection is inevitable. And then and then once you're into the activation of the terrible sadness around you're always going to be rejected, you're always going to be alone, this is never going to work out, that can go on for days because it's thought-based. They don't have clarity on it. To stop it, so that can go on. And then if it's a somaticized emotional experience that is a strong activation in the pool, that can last for days too. So yeah, you really need to develop the clarity to see what's actually going on in order to break it apart so that it doesn't happen so much. Is that making sense? But the initial spike is a few seconds. The longest activation of the pool I ever had was 12 days. So even that's finite in a sense. But it was a wild ride. I was on the dismissing side of things, so anticipating rejection was the way that I experienced it, but also being disorganized. Rejection meant being killed, so it could be intense. Henry.
One thing I've been wondering for a while is which, if any, attachment style would be closer to secure between preoccupied or dismissive?
Really, if you look at the cascade, it's secure, dismissing, helplessly preoccupied, fearful avoidant, complexly disorganized, and fearfully preoccupied in terms of, and mainly what you're talking about is the skill set and what has to be developed in order to come out of it. So avoidance is closer to secure than preoccupation is. And that mainly has to do with the capacity to explore. So if you look at the fearful avoidant people can explore better than fearfully preoccupied people, and complexly disorganized, because they have the avoidant component and the preoccupied component too, they have better exploration. And then at the far end is the fearfully preoccupied person who has very low mentalizing, very low emotional regulation, and very little capacity to explore. That's why it's harder.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you. That's cool.
Dismissing, if you look at the mentalizing frame on a scale of 1 to 9, secure people tend to come out 6 or higher without any intervention. Dismissing people are in the 4 to 5 range, organized, preoccupied in the 3 to 4 range, and disorganized people are below 3 in terms of mentalizing. So there's a lot to do in order to come out of that. Epistemic trust tends to be intact more or less in organized people, and it tends to be really broken in disorganized people. So you also have to repair epistemic trust in order to be able to learn from somebody. You can't learn from somebody, you can't get help to resolve this. So the part of it is also the repair of epistemic trust. And then, of course, how do you pick trustworthy people, which is one of the other impediments for disorganized people? How do you do it? Because your epistemic trust is broken, and you most of the time really don't monitor whether people do what they say they're going to do. Well, we've talked for a longer time than we normally do, but maybe let's do just a quick loving kindness practice. Okay, let go of the meditation. How's that? So on Saturday is the second of the exploration half day longs. It starts at 9, ends at 1 Pacific time. I'm hoping it'll be a good class. We'll talk about, we talked about intermediate states of mentalizing in the first one, and we'll do the advanced set in this one, and relate that to how those advanced stages of mentalizing really do further primary exploration. And then in November, I'm going to do a workshop called Family Archaeology, or Home for the Holidays, from the attachment perspective, so that you can go home and actually take a look at how your attachment conditioning unfolded for you as a child, and also to try and navigate the family relationships in a way that you can get something out of it. I really am convinced that because to be loved by our caregivers is so fundamentally important to us as children, that if we can, as adults, develop a sense that there was love there, it's really useful to us. And that if we can do that when we go home, instead of the constant cycle of being disappointed that they didn't meet the needs that you had then, or they can't meet the needs that you have now, to really focus on the things that they can do and the expressions that do feel good. And so you can set aside the difficult parts and really just accept the things that are there. That's a process of seeing it clearly. And then the needs that they can't meet, you can go out into the world and find people that will meet them, and will be happy to meet them, so that you don't go without. I think that there's a kind of deprivation that's activated when you go home and you're still trying to get from them things that they can't really give you. And then you have peace at home, and you have a sense of the value that you have for them. Obviously, this is based on what's actually there, not a pretend setup. And then we'll be into the holidays, and the year will be over, and we can all look forward to what's next. I've been told by my person who, let's see here, supposed to drop a couple of things into the chat, which I'll try and do now. I do offer the class on a donation basis. Really appreciate any amount. If you have resources, it helps me and helps support the work that we do here at Mettagroup. And then if you're curious about our if you're interested at all in the exploration workshop, there's a link. Good to see you. Thank you for your practice. We'll see you soon. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.